Hi, I'm Ian McAllister.
And I'm Jamie Adams, and welcome to this special episode of Brainwaves. Now, this special episode, we're going to be talking about Megagames. Now, listeners of the podcast may have heard that I recently participated in the Megagame Watch the Skies Second Sight, run by Southwest Megagames, at the UK Games Expo this year. Listeners may also have got bored with me saying how much I enjoyed it and how I think I might be hooked on Megagames now. Now, for this special, I'm not really the person to talk about this, because I am not well versed at all in this topic. So we've reached out and have with us today some experts in the field. We are joined today by John Mizon from Southwest Megagames and Matthew Bambridge, aka Mr. Megagame. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Now, I realise Ian's going to be taking a little bit of a back seat, as Ian, you have not played any Megagames, yes?
I have not at all, though I'm very keen to after your very effervescent reports from UK Games Expo.
And he's not just saying that because the man who ran it is on this call as well.
He's been going on about it quite a lot.
I have, to the point of annoyance. To start off with, John, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please, and Southwest Megagames?
Yeah, so my name is John Mizon. I've been running Megagames since late 2015. Basically, I saw a video that I think a lot of people saw from Shut Up and Sit Down, where they went to a game called Watch the Skies in London, I think the year prior, and the game Watch the Skies is simply about aliens showing up and sort of how various different major countries react to that sort of international politics simulation in that sense. And I looked into that and I thought about running my own thing. Eventually, I decided to just download the pack. There was a PDF pack for it and run it. And I did that. And then a bunch of my friends who live in Bristol, which is quite near to where I live, said we'd love for you to do it in Bristol instead, because the first one was in Cheltenham. And I ran the one in Bristol, and then I just didn't stop. And wound up with running sort of Megagames now as a sort of mostly full-time job, more or less.
Wow.
Basically sort of taking it upon myself to run a bunch of Megagames just because I love them, and none of them were happening near where I live, generally speaking. They were almost all in London or, generally speaking, elsewhere that was very far away. And so just started running them around. And that's what sort of brings us up to today, so that's more or less my life history regarding Megagames.
Amazing. Matt, how about your experience with Megagames? Kind of when and where did it begin for you?
Yeah, thanks. Very much in the same way to John, to be honest. So back in 2014, there was a game called Watch the Skies. It was run by Jim Warman and Megagame Makers. And the Shut Up and Sit guys basically did a video of that. I saw it, and like John, was immediately hooked. So I got on the good old Insta-webs to Jim Warman to see what was going on. I went to one of his playtests, a game he ran out for Warwick University. My first game was something called Funeral Games, which was Death of Alexander the Great, a load of people playing as bodyguards. The Macedonian Empire is falling to pieces, and so I went and played that game, loved it. Since then, 2014, I think I've played about 64 games earlier in the year.
That's cute, Matt. That's cute.
Earlier in the year, I started kind of doing live streams on Facebook and Instagram as Mr. Megagame, and this year I'm trying to attend 32 games. Finally trying to do more games in a year than John.
How many games do you get through in a year, John?
Yeah, generally speaking, somewhere between 20 and 30, depending on circumstances.
Wow.
So I think we'd better start off, although I've been talking about it a lot, I've been rather cack-handed about explaining what a Megagame kind of actually is. I usually kind of fall back on, it's a mixture between a role-playing game, a board game, and a LARP. Now, with your expert knowledge, how would both of you go about describing a Megagame to someone who has never heard of them before?
I mean, to be honest, not that much different from what you said. If you want to give someone the elevator pitch, somewhere between a board game and an RPG and a LARP is pretty on point. It's generally speaking, it is large by definition. That's sort of the one undeniable defining feature of a Megagame. Most people say that your minimum number's going to be around 20, maybe slightly less. And then most games will sort of be between 40 and 70-ish players. So that's sort of your key element. And the game is sort of all about the structure of how all those players are interacting with each other. So it's a game that's more about information and communication than it is about, like, say, a board game is about units and resources and all that kind of stuff. So there may be a very simple board game-like mechanic that's very, very simple, wouldn't really work as a board game on its own, because the true meat of the game is in the number of players and how they try and keep lines of communication clear or intentionally mislead each other, and all the different kind of opportunities you get when the play space is that big in terms of player count.
Yeah, I kind of agree with John on all of that, really. I mean, I kind of fond of calling them an experience in organised chaos, because that's essentially what they are. For the differentiators between a board game, I mean, the biggest kind of board game-like thing I've done is probably about 12 people. I have played The Empire lot, which is like 2,500 people in a field, but there's an intensity of experience that comes into play. In 8 hours, I get as a big intensity of experience, as much as I do in the 2.5 days when you go to Empire. You've got, as John says, between 20 and for the huge games 300, but normally 20 and 80 people all trying to do their thing over multiple different mechanics. And something that really does kind of come out in those mega games is, unlike a board game, you have sub-games going on. So some people may be doing a science game, some people may be militarily going off on one, launching nukes at each other. Some people are doing the politics game, trying to barely contain the military players who desperately want to nuke everyone in sight. So you've got all of these kind of things going on, and that intensity of experience for 8 hours is something that really gives Megagames a flavour nothing like anything else I've ever played, really.
How do you sort of keep that intensity going? Because, I mean, I find, like, GMing for about 6 people for a few hours quite a stressful experience as it is. I can't imagine effectively GMing for 40 people for 8. So how do you sort of, like, go about keeping the focus, keeping that intensity going over the course of those hours?
Well, from a player's point of view, and I'll let John step in from, I'm sure, what is the harrowing experience for actually running one of these things. But from a player experience, you have a setting, you have teams. Mega games are all about conflict. Now, that doesn't have to be military conflict, and as games are evolving, you're seeing more games that aren't just about military conflict, but they all have conflict. And so essentially, if you give 40 people briefings and tasks to do, and that's the important thing, they have to have tasks and decisions to make through the day, sure, they will create their own chaos. Much like life, if they've all got competing objectives, they'll go and they'll make their chaos, basically. And so control and game runners like John then are guiding people rather than managing every interaction.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, and Matt's more or less alluded to the core concepts there. The reason that you can sort of do this is, like I say, it is like a big RPG, but it's also like a board game in that, there are elements there to do with, your team briefing, which is sort of an explanation of what your team is about, what your roles are about, your character brief, as it were, and also some objectives and some interests and some goals you have. And so the players already have that, and they know what that is, and they don't need to ask a GM to explain it to them. It's already there. And then, the mechanics are laid out board game style. Everyone knows how they work and can just run with them and play with those mechanics. And then it's sort of the interactions around those. And a lot of that stuff, some games more than others depending on the design, but a lot of that stuff, just the players are sort of self-managing because, they're playing the game, they're working on their own objectives, and they're using the mechanics they already understand. So with that kind of going on its own, the GMing stuff on top of that doesn't have to be as sort of one-on-one, high intensity, high detail that you would get in, say, GMing an RPG for a few people, where you're sort of like the main conduit of all the information and all the interactions.
Yeah. Cool. Sounds amazing.
It's you could say I enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like quite an intense experience.
Yeah, you should definitely come along and play one.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should. It'd be great. It was something I think you alluded to there, Matt, which was saying that there is a conflict at the heart of every mega game. Now, obviously, a little backstory for listeners. Mega Games started in, you gentlemen will correct me because I'm probably wrong, about 1980?
Around then, possibly earlier?
Yeah. I don't know the exact date, but generally speaking, yeah, it was a few decades ago. people who were definitely not me and Matt started sort of playing around with, I think, and don't quote me on this, I may well be wrong, but the people who would eventually become the Megagame makers in London, they were playing sort of war games and war game-like scenarios, and they thought that, in reality, a lot of these campaigns and scenarios are much more complicated than this, because there's so much logistics and communication problems that just like, if you have a game with 2 players or 6 players, it is impossible to represent just how difficult those communication and logistical challenges are. And then they scaled that up to represent that kind of thing, and that sort of is the inspiration for massive numbers of players in games, trying to represent those kinds of challenges that you just can't do with fewer players.
Yeah, my understanding is basically there's a guy called, and unfortunately I can't remember his last name, a guy called Paddy, who used to kind of be an historian, work for the government, and he started off kind of doing these big kind of training things for the military, essentially. And so that's kind of where they grew out of, and then Jim Wallman, Megagame Makers, picked them up, and they've been running them, for about 30 years, on very kind of militaristic themes, with the odd one out being things like Watch the Skies and City of Shadows, which was a kind of play on mad scientists in the 1930s America. So they very much had their root in a professional military game. Paddy Griffiths, thank you, John.
The mad scientist one in the 1930s. Yes, please. Hi.
I was having,
You're on that, and I will come running. That sounds amazing.
I was having me look the other night, and I was looking at some of their kind of early ones, which were like a day in the life of a Battle of Britain pilot, taking place at like an old country house, and this is like the early 80s. But it's interesting, you said that the Megagame makers do have wargaming roots or military history roots. And then, John, I believe I saw that you'd had a bit of correspondence with Quentin Smith from Shut Up and Sit Down over Megagames that do have conflict, but again, not in the military sense. I think one that I saw you mentioned was a game called Foodies that was in development.
I mean, that was just sort of very speculative. People had mentioned it somewhat. I honestly can't remember who. I'm really sorry about that. But someone had mentioned, what are your ideas? What are your ideas for Megagames that are stranger than usual? And there was sort of a thread about it, and I was just mentioning some of the ones I'd seen. I think one of them was sort of an Animals of Farthing Wood style thing, where it all takes place in a neighborhood, but all the players are different woodland animals. And there was another one which was about food in some way that I'm afraid I don't actually remember it all now I think about it.
I'll be honest, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
The big one in recent times that was run this year was Trope High by Becky Ladley of Becky Blogs up in Leeds. And that was a game basically about a bunch of high schoolers in their final year, and you've got a bunch of things going on like the Vampire Diaries, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so everyone's got secrets. Some people are cheerleaders, jocks, drama students, people on the outs and the goths, and they all had these secrets. Some of them were time travelers, some of them were werewolves, fey creatures, communist spies trying to bring about the communist utopia.
It was an American high school TV show, The Game, but also all the players were protagonists. So it was a bit chaotic.
Yeah, and that's an example of a really good style of game that I'd like to see more of in Megagames. It's something that's very, very, very different and still has conflict between everyone. The core of it is conflict. You have all these protagonists trying to do their thing, people trying to get into college, people trying to become the most popular, class president, prom king, homecoming king. All of these things are going on. So it's all very much still driven by conflict, but not in the traditional sense that you'd have from a mega game where you're playing Case Blue and you're the Germans deciding whether or not you want to dive into Stalingrad. Pro tip, don't go to Stalingrad.
Don't go to Stalingrad. Words to live by.
John, you mentioned earlier that you were sort of basically doing this full time now. Now, what sort of groups are you running Megagames for? Is it all sort of like nerdy geek conventions, or are there other sort of outlets that you're going to, like businesses as team building exercises kind of stuff? Is that something that's happening?
It's definitely something I've considered, and I've talked to people about it. I specifically haven't actually done anything like that yet. However, I'm aware that there are a few people out there who are doing that.
Oh, cool.
Jim Wallman, the guy who designed that original Watch the Skies game, he does a lot of sort of consulting work and sort of professional gaming work. I don't know exactly what you call it, where he takes sort of games that are like this to more professional environments.
Sure.
And I think there's a couple of other people out there doing it too. I specifically am not one of them, but yeah, I've definitely looked into it, and it definitely has applications. I mean, like we say, I've also read about not necessarily people who are like me who are taking that to businesses, but just businesses who on their own have sort of intentionally set up large-scale simulations to represent particular things. I remember, I think the Canadian government did it when the Olympics was coming or something along those lines, where they sort of represented lots of different teams, lots of different authorities and agencies, and the committee who was trying to organize the games, and then there was a very small team representing like a few different groups that would be, terrorists or like disruptive protesters, and throwing all kinds of things at the wall and seeing how people would react, and more importantly, how people would coordinate and communicate with each other, or how they wouldn't, and using that as, to prepare and identify existing weaknesses. And there's also a website called PAXsims, run by a person called Rex Brynan, which again is all about this kind of serious gaming stuff. Very interesting. He had a game which went a tiny bit viral recently called ISIS Crisis, which is basically it's not a mega game, but it's a very similar concept of sort of realistic simulation gaming, which is obviously based in sort of the Middle East, and the different factions involved in, ISIS and tackling it and all that kind of stuff.
Cool. I've got a feeling we reported on something from PAXsims site before. The name rings a vague bell to me, but can't for the life of me think what it might be.
They talk a lot about gaming stuff.
Yeah.
No, that's fair. So, John, I want to turn to you just for a wee second. As you said, you've been running and creating Megagames. I'm not wanting a peek behind the curtain or anything, but in a very general term, where would you potentially start with creating a megagame? What's your starting point?
Well, the point where I always start is something will take my interest as like a really compelling idea or concept or event. So I'll hear about a particular conflict, or like, a historical event, a historical conflict, or like just see a scenario or a situation. And typically these are going to be places where there's a lot of different actors, there's a lot of different people who want different things out of a situation, and they're all in the situation together, and it's all about sort of the complex political and possibly military and resource-based things going on between them. And, there's a number of ways it can play out. So, for example, a game I ran recently called A World Divided is essentially a sci-fi retelling of the American Revolutionary War, because you've got, like, the 13 colonies are all independent governments with their own interests and different ways they differ from each other. And you've also got lots of different Native American groups. You've got the British, you've got the French, and you've got all these different groups sort of together, and there's a lot of like wiggle room or flexibility as to what they actually do in that situation and how they handle it. And so, you get these sort of ideas in your head, and from there you sort of go on to, okay, so how do I turn that into a game where all these different people can make these different choices and choose how and whether or not they're going to work together and who with.
I'm a little bit of an amateur game designer myself. How on earth do you play test a mega game?
Well, the running joke is you play it. So, generally speaking, yeah, they're sort of too big to properly play test. Maybe the traditional sense, like with board game playtesting, you basically are just playing the board game, but you only need a few people to do that.
Yeah.
With mega game playtesting, I know there are certain people who do different things. A lot of people will have specific mechanics, or perhaps they'll take a specific part of the game, like, oh, here's the science game with the resources that go in and how they come out and the different players. Well, we'll just playtest that specific part. Other people will sort of playtest things, in that sort of way where they will sequester certain sections of the game off and playtest them like that. I tend to playtest the game in full, but I will sort of make a playtest version of the game which can be played with just about 10 or a dozen players, where each player will maybe represent multiple teams, or one player represents an entire team of people, and I'll simplify the turn structure and some of the resources and sort of check it all works out that way. And so yeah, it's not easy to playtest, but there are sort of workarounds to sort of figure out how it's going to go.
Yeah, I just jump in there and say that John's approach to playtesting is probably one of the better ones in the community. He seems to do larger playtests the most often, and it's a really great thing, because one of the things that can come up when you play a game is you can tell that the interactions haven't really been tested out, and that's not really anyone's fault in a lot of ways, because when you've got a game that's designed to run from 30 to 60 players, it's very challenging to do that. But also kind of presents an opportunity to try and do what John does, which is get people in for minimal or no fee for a day to have essentially what's going to be some fun, testing out some new mechanics, learning more about a new game. So I'd very much like to see, and I think a lot of people would like to see, John's approach to play testing kind of go wider. As more mega games are being run now, inevitably that means that the quality of games needs to keep on rising, and so those larger playtests, I think, are very much a way to do that. So absolutely hats off to John for doing that on a regular basis.
We've mentioned Shut and Sit Down a couple of times, and their sort of video about mega games really seems to have given the whole hobby a kick. Have you both seen like quite a rise in mega games over the last few years since that video?
We are the rise.
Yeah.
I mean, so pre-2014, the Megagame community was sort of a specific group of people, mainly London.
Yeah.
I think a few of them had moved to the north, in Manchester and Leeds, and I believe there were a few people in mainland Europe, mainly the Netherlands, if I'm correct. And you know, there's definitely several hundred, maybe a few thousand people who were there and dropping in and out. There's a core group of maybe 100 or so who were the main designers and players who did it the most. And then, the Shut Up and Sit Down video just sort of brought that to a much, much larger audience. I think that video itself got a few 100,000 views on YouTube and Vimeo, depending on where it was uploaded at the time. And so that brought in a big chunk of players, myself included. And in fact, shortly after it was made, Jim Wallman, the original designer of Watch the Skies, did those massive games. He ran 3 different games. Each one was about 300 players each. Yeah, they were absurdly large.
It was about a year later, the Shut Up and Sit Down put out 2-part videos of them doing the second Watch the Skies. So, I mean, we'll put the links in the show notes if you want to go and see them. It's thoroughly impressive.
That was the first of the 3 300-player games, and that sort of just shows you how many people had seen it and thought, that looks really cool, I want to try it. That kind of thing was possible. Yeah. And since then, I think there was a massive surge, which has calmed down a bit, but yes, there's a lot more people now. And not just people who saw the Shut Up and Sit Down videos. There's now a fairly sizable sort of second wave of people who haven't seen the Shut Up and Sit Down videos, but know people who have, and therefore have heard about it from them and, start going from there. I definitely have a few friends who fit that category. But so that sort of opened up to a much wider audience in terms of just people being aware of it. And then that's itself sort of perpetuates because those people start running games or attending games or, helping games get spread around.
That rather nicely leads on to the question I was going to have for both of you. In the past year or so, you said mega games have been rising up, and we've got maybe a second or third generation people who are getting into it. But it's making a more public jump from the hall, as it were, to the gaming table. This year, we've seen Vampire the Masquerade Blood Feud released, which proudly boasts that it is a mega game in a box. And Jim Wallman, one of the proto-mega game men, now owns a company called Stone, Paper, Scissors. And he's offering Watch the Skies, his game, as a boxed game for 170 of your English pounds.
Or Scottish pounds.
Or Scottish pounds. We're not picky. Alongside any other older mega games. Sorry, here we go.
I was just going to ask what your question was.
I think what Jamie's trying to drive at is basically, do you think though that experience of, I mean, you both like being involved in mega games for a long time, do you think the experience of a mega game can be squashed down into a box? I mean, it is a very large box; it's not being squashed down a huge amount, but can that experience be learnt as such from like a rule book and written material and presumably scenario guides and that kind of thing that are in there?
I'll say that as of yet I haven't played Blood Feud. I'm actually going to be playing it in a few weeks' time over at Gencon. So I'm going to be going over and I think I'm playing 4 mega games and Blood Feud while I'm over there in a couple of days.
Cool.
Look, I have a problem. I'm aware of the problem, but I can stop anytime I want.
What are the other four, just out of interest, on a slight tangent?
Oh, wow. Can I come back to that?
Sure.
One of them's Den of Wolves. I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, so they're running Den of Wolves over there and a few others. I will get their full list up now so I can mention that slightly later. But
sure.
In terms of Blood Feud, I'm going to be interested to see what that's like. In a game that's meant to be played in a few hours, I'm questioning if you can get a full Megagame experience out of it. But the way I view those kind of hopefully rising genre of Megagames in a box is a way that they can introduce people into the hobby in a different way. So there's been smaller games around, like Bring Them Home, King and Country recently, and there's much discussion in the community about whether they're full Megagames, and I would say it doesn't matter a hoot at all, really. What matters is that they provide a good experience for people, and they're a larger than normal game. So whether the Vampire the Masquerade board game, Megagame in a box, is a true Megagame or not, provides that experience, it kind of doesn't have to, because all it has to do is get people interested in coming along to and designing a big game between 30 and 80 people. And the designer really seems to have poured his heart into that. So I'm really stoked to play it. We'll see what it's like. I'm hoping it's going to be a good time. But the primary function for me is a way for them to get people in through a different medium who only have 2 or 3 hours to spend on an evening and don't want to commit to coming and playing 8 hours with 40 people that they don't know, which is an intimidating experience, right? So I view it as a way for people to get into the hobby.
I think it's worth clarifying as well in terms of Megagame in a box, which is sort of dual meaning. I know very, very little about the Blood Feud game. Specifically, Jim's game is actually the full Megagame. It's just he's put all the physical materials you need to play it in a box, so that if you wanted to buy it and run it, you don't have to manufacture those yourselves, which until now has generally been the only way to run a Megagame, unless you know someone who already has the materials and is willing to lend them to you. But yeah, there are sort of these smaller games out there that are like Megagames, like Matt was saying, which Blood Feud might be. Like I say, I don't really know what it is. And there are some other games out there, like Bring Them Home, which are like Megagames, but smaller. Like I said, you generally need sort of there's a certain threshold at which it genuinely is impossible and information and communication gets away from you. But there are games that are sort of below that threshold but still have the atmosphere of a lot of people, more going on than you can truly keep track of, and just sort of free form role playing mixed with a bit of mechanics and a lot of story and a lot of character. So yeah, those are great, like Matt says, for being less intimidating and less of a commitment. So if you're not sure about what you want to play, then this is easier to get into. And also just, more variety. It's a different type of game. It's shorter. It's easier to do. So you can play that, and you can keep playing regular, long, massive mega games. So it's nice to have a little bit of choice here and there, and have some more new games coming out with slightly different formats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just to return back to Gencon, they're running 11 games. So Alliance Last Days,
and you're only playing 4 of them, Matt. You coward!
Just disappointing all round.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of them run at the same time, and some of them were.
That is no excuse.
No. I know. Maybe one day I'll graduate John to being able to play 2 mega games at once. We'll see how it goes. But yes, they're running
a mega game inside a mega game.
I will play it. So I'm playing by Coin and Dagger, which is kind of politics and skullduggery. People who are nobles, merchants, magistrates, or scoundrels, and all trying to take over the city in their different kind of ways. There's Deep Havens, which is dwarves trying to dig for legendary items. I'm playing Heavy Rain, which is nobility and betrayal, and Sickle, which is a Scythe fan-made mega game. And as I said, the Blood Feud game. And they've also got kind of Alliance Last Days, Den of Wolves, Dragon Thrones, Heavy Rain, Watch the Skies. I would pop on over to Megagame Coalition.com homepage, where they've got a bunch of those there for you. So I'm really excited about that, because in much the same way that John and Alex ran Watch the Skies Second Sight at UK Games Expo. This is being run at another massive convention to really kind of get Megagames out there. And I was really pleased to see John and Alex run Watch the Skies at the expo, because there aren't normally Megagames there. And I was kind of concerned from a player point of view that they would have problems filling the game, because getting people to give up a whole day worth of a con.
That's the main challenge with running Megagames at cons, is that they are sort of 6 hours, and most people want to do the stuff that's at the con. That's one of the main reasons we wanted to do it on the Sundays. It's sort of like a less intense day than the Saturday.
Sure.
But yeah, generally speaking, it was actually quite interesting when we first mentioned it to the people who are running UKGA, and we set it up, and like after a couple of weeks, I think we had like 12 people signed up, which, if you're not aware, is not that many, because the game is like 67 people. And the UKG organizers emailed me and Alex, and they like, is this all right? Like, do you want us to help you promote it? And we said that'd be nice, but generally speaking, these things tend to build up over time, and the interest improves. And we did actually end up selling out, I think, about 3 or 4 weeks before the day itself, which was really nice to see, especially seeing as everyone except for like Matt and one other player were brand new to Megagames, more or less, which was really great, because that was the entire point of running it at the con. Other than just trying to put on a fun game, was trying to get people who had never played a Megagame before, give them like a really easy way to access playing a Megagame by putting it at a con they were already at, if you get what I mean. So I'm really pleased that so many people were there and so many people saw it, because it's great that more people can just sort of hear about Megagames and get the chance to play one when maybe there aren't any near where they live, or they just hadn't heard about them yet.
That's pretty much the exact reason why I was interested. Similar to you, I'd seen the Shut Up and Sit Down video. I was like, great, Megagames, where are they? Mostly in London. Great. And then I saw this and went, okay, it's on the Sunday. I'll just do everything I need on the Friday and Saturday.
Jamie's in the middle of writing up his war diaries as well, so we're going to have that up on the site as the diaries of the Prime Minister of Japan. I had a great suggestion the other day, Jamie, that you should voice act your diaries as the Prime Minister of Japan, and we should put it out as a podcast.
You had an exciting day as the President of Japan, as I recall from my table over at the Secretary General of the UN.
I had a hell of a day as the Prime Minister of Japan.
I've only read it, and it sounded pretty exciting.
You only read the first 2 turns.
It's always an interesting day as the President of Japan. You've got a lot of competing things going on. But yeah, it was really lovely to see so many new players. And obviously I went along as Mr. Megagame to do live streaming and capture the action. And it was a really nice buzz to have so many new players coming out and try this hobby that obviously I love, because it's basically my main hobby these days. So yeah, it was a really nice experience.
Can I say, Matt, it was very nice of you to not use your experience to try and take over the world and manipulate newer players. It's a very kind of you.
But
good point.
If I recall from my notes, I mean, you were Secretary General at the UN, and pretty much the UN would just spend the entire time just snarking at each other.
They do love to snark at each other, and it's an exercise basically in middle management to try and get people to focus on some of the larger issues. But I was very happy with the UN that day, that it kind of came together and kind of helped the world out with its problems. And I embezzled a minimum of cash. In fact, I embezzled no cash, more as I just kind of shunted some stuff off for side projects of talking to aliens and funding UN peacekeeping mission.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. People have so as people play their first Megagame and they mention observations they've had. For example, you suggesting that the UN was a bit snarky and difficult, and me and Matt came from that game going, man, that UN was like one of the best and nicest ones we've had. They're normally so much more aggressive and terrifying.
Yes, absolutely, John is right. I've seen that UN dissolve into complete and utter chaos on many occasions, sometimes as a result of my fault. But yes, it was a lovely peaceful day with a minimum of snark.
So after Gencon, where can people find you next, John? What are you running after that?
Well, so I'm generally running games mostly around the Southwest. I don't know how soon this podcast goes up, but this Saturday I'm running Watch the Skies' second site in Reading, and then possibly the week after that there's near Mansfield is a town called Sutton in Atsfield. There's a small gaming centre up there that's requested that I run Watch the Skies' second out of there, so I said I'd do it. And then later on I'm running Den of Wolves, which is my game that's loosely inspired by Battlestar Galactica. So teams represent different ships, and there's lots of different ships, and there's a military ship, and there's a government that's trying to hold everything together. I'm running that in Cardiff.
Cool.
If I could, I would be there like a shot. That sounds amazing.
Well, I'm running that in Cardiff, and also somewhere else later in the year, not officially announced yet. And then in October, I've actually got a brand new game, which is based on the Cuban Revolution. So 1950s Cuba. What happened in history was, of course, Fidel Castro took power. This is the same scenario run from the beginning. Not necessarily Fidel Castro taking power, but that particular conflict/political scenario. So
wow,
yeah, it's it's a fairly small game, but there's like about 5 different factions, including various government and rebel factions, and it's sort of how that plays out. So I'm looking forward to see how that one goes.
What are you up to next yourself, Matthew?
See, I've actually going along to Watch the Skies in Reading this week, the John running, and I will be the president of Russia, and I will try and not get up to any shenanigans. I've got the Gencon adventure beginning of August. Then I've got a break of a few weeks, actually, before I do Kingdom of Seasons run by True North Megagames, which is a high fantasy megagame inspired by Lord of the Rings, among other things. And then after that, I've got various ones like Grace of God, which Ed Silverstone of Reading Megagames are running, which is the English Civil War, and then John's Cuba game, and then others. I've got about another 10 or 12 before the end of the year. The 10 or 12 not including Gencon.
Well, I don't know about you, gents. I could just spend hours talking about this, but unfortunately we're going to have to bring this to an unfortunate end. So I just want to say thank you both very much, John and Matt, for coming on and listening while I bombard you with questions about, it's really great, how do you make it so good?
All right, thank you very much for having us. It was a very, very interesting discussion.
Yeah,
no, it's been a pleasure, gents.
That was absolutely great, thank you.
And if the listeners out there wanted to contact you or to find out what you're up to, what would be the best way to do that?
Well, I have a website, swmegagames.co.uk, and I also have a Facebook and a Twitter called Southwest Megagames. Really, the best thing, though, is probably send me an email at contact@Southwest Megagames and ask me to be put on the mailing list, and you'll receive an email every time there's a new game. But feel free to investigate any of those.
Yeah, for me, I'm Mr. Megagame on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I kind of go to games, well, not every week, but almost every week. So I do live streams. If you want to hear more about my games, please pop along. Any questions that you've got as well, and possibly a little bit early because this may go out a couple of days before the site launches. But me and a couple of others are launching a website called MegagameAssembly.com, and that's going to have a big calendar of all the games in the world on it that we've put together, and people can come along and add their games. It's got Megagaming resources in terms of kind of listing out all the different groups that we know about. There's some links to free Megagames up there. There's a blog and a podcast and about us, contact fact, that type of thing. So that will be out kind of around the same time as this goes up. So please pop along to that and sign up to the newsletter, take a look, because we're hoping that will be a great resource. Well, we know it will be a great resource, but we're hoping that people enjoy it so we can continue producing content for that.
Thank you very much. Yes, we'll stick all the links that have been mentioned in the show notes, so feel free to look for them. And, of course, you can always hit up online. Iain, are you interested in Megagames now?
I am interested in Megagames, yeah, definitely. Especially Mad Scientist in the 30s. Yes, please. Sign me up for that one. That sounds amazing. And the Battlestar Galactica one as well, or Battlestar Galactica inspired as well. That sounds fantastic. So yeah, I really need to give one a go, and like I say, there's so many of them now, and they're getting more ubiquitous, more people are running them. So I think there were a couple of people trying to run some up here, but I don't know exactly where. I'm sure I heard of a Star Wars one being run somewhere.
So True North Megagames are running games in Scotland and the far north of England. Right, cool. Look into True North Megagames. They're the ones who are going to be closest to you.
Yeah,
great.
Carlisle, Glasgow. The one you're talking about was Rebel Country, and that was run up in Dundee.
That's the one. Yeah, so yeah, maybe a giant brain day out.
That was fantastic. Well, thank you very much again to John and Matt, and thank you very much for listening. If you like what you've listened to, then the best way to help us out is to share the podcast and drop us a review and a rating on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter @TheGiantBrain. Instagram, Giant Brain UK. On Facebook, we are The Giant Brain. Our website is giantbrain.co.uk, or you can drop us an email at giantbrainuk@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. Look after yourselves, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.